Okay, welcome all to another episode of Talking with Poets. I'm thrilled and honored to have with me Mark Pawlak, old friend and colleague and poet from Hanging Loose Press and the University of Massachusetts and MIT and this an American history really, poetry history as well as political history for these last decades. And all of that is remembered and analyzed and brought up in this book, My Deniversity, which I'm putting up to the screen here, published by MadHat Press, just out. A must read, I say, because it's a unique book, really, and I will talk about that uniqueness as we welcome. So, welcome, Mark.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Sure,
Yes.
we're thrilled. I mentioned various universities. I know this is not in the questions we advance, but it seems like a way to begin. I mean, about teaching and poetry and teaching and you coming to poetry through a workshop, very specifically Denis Levertov's workshop at MIT back in, I think it was 1970, was it? Yeah.
6970. Yeah.
1970, yeah. So perhaps my first very broad question, is the poet a teacher, and if so, of what?
Well, I think there probably different poets would answer it in different way. I think so. Yes, I certainly think so. And there's innumerable poets who actually teach in universities. I'm not, although I'm a teacher. I rarely teach poetry. I teach mathematics, having a background in physics. And that's my way of supporting my poetry habits. Since, as we know,
Right.
poetry doesn't pay very well. But I also think that a poet is a teacher can be, certainly as a choice, in the poems themselves, in writing the poems themselves. And I believe it was Horace, who said that poetry should both instruct and entertain. And that's something that I've certainly taken to heart in my poetry. To try to instruct in the sense of how to understand and approach language critically and its uses and abuses critically. We live in a culture, and ever more so these days, where the sense of what's real and what's unreal and what's truthful and untruthful is undermined continually. And I think that's one of the poet's roles, to address that issue. And I certainly have, over the years, attempted to do that in my own poetry, but not with an overly serious lecturing, didactic manner. I've tried to infuse it with humor, irony, and satire to kind of leaven the seriousness of the issues I'm trying to
Right.
address.
Listening to you speak about how now even more than ever the need to have some kind of truth when we are being flooded by a lot of lies and disinformation. I can't help but think of 1984 and which of course is the Orwell wrote that book or published it in 1948, and he turned the numbers around and he imagined this future in 1984, much of which came true and much of which is with us today. So when you write your poems, or when you read poems, do you turn to poems for, may I put it this way, the real news, the truth in some form or another?
Right. And that's, you're sort of echoing William Carlos Williams, who famously said, and I think this was the preface of a book of his written during just around World War II, I think, that you can't get the news from poems, but men die every day for lack of what is found there. So it's news of a different kind that poetry presents. And I keep thinking, poets keep addressing this question all the time, and other writers. I'm thinking of Salman Rushdie, who
Mm.
back 20, oh my goodness, no, it must be 40 years ago during the regime of Ronald Reagan, who was calling the Nicaraguan Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. And Rushdie, really took umbrage with that and said, the modern world lacks not only hiding places but certainties. He went on to say there is no consensus about reality. Think about it. This hasn't changed even today. It's got
Mm.
it seems imperative to me, Rushdie said, that literature enter such arguments because what is being disputed is nothing less than what is truth and untruth. And if writers leave the business of making pictures of the world to politicians, it will be one of history's great and abject abdications. So yeah,
But
it's actually
yeah,
really
I mean, so many things going on. The brutal terrorist murder of people in Buffalo in the supermarket of black Americans, the killing of the journalist in Palestine, and then the debate about who shot whom and the bullet and the nature of the bullet. Is, and where does the poet come in into these questions of life and death and very deep pain and suffering? Um, I think you would say the poet writes about these things, or the poet confronts these things somehow in his or her verses. Go ahead.
yeah, I think so, and I think that I mean, if we were to update William Carlos Williams speaking for him, half a century later, I think he might say that the consistency and the enormity of political dishonesty, sharply honed with the powerful linguistic tools of advertising, have forced poets not only to convey their own news, but to correct the news that is found elsewhere. So that would be one aspect. By the way, I don't know if you remember, I grew up in Buffalo, so I'm really
Oh yes, yes,
deeply, deeply grieved by what has transpired there.
right. And the Buffalo Sequence is your first
My
book,
first book was the Buffalo, yes, and
and
I'm a third generation uh, Pole, and my ancestors settled the east side where this
murder took place. Yeah,
despicable murder took place, was where new immigrants always settled. So back in the early 20th century, that was where the Polish and Italian and Irish immigrants settled, and worked in the factories and the railroads and the foundries. And then during the 60s, there was the urban renewal, which as Baldwin rightly said, Negro removal, and it sort of led to blacks being moved out of their decrepit housing and trying to find their way into working class neighborhoods, and it led to white flight, and the working class moved to the suburbs and left the inner city, uh, you know, uh, largely to African Americans, and that's that's that same neighborhood that I knew as a child.
right, right. Uh, can you read us some of your poems, or a poem, perhaps
I'll read one
perhaps
from the
from the
Buffalo.
Buffalo Sequence?
Yeah, I'll read one poem from the Buffalo sequence, one or two from the Buffalo sequence.
Excuse me.
Uh, I grew up in a housing project, sort of, for World War II veterans families uh, in Buffalo, and here's one of the early poems in that sequence. They're all untitled. They're just numbered. I would paint childhoods of brick walls and mother's flowered red apron, Brick red the houses, brick community, in which courtyards of paved over grasses, it is evening and the children are playing among garbage cans, hide and seek from the shadows of squalor, and where the moon in a rage is roaming the neighborhood for a single tree to break against. Let them hang that in their museums.
Please, let's hear another.
Yeah, I'll read another one. This is the first poem in the sequence. Never again Joey, the cross-eyed, who in the church parking lot with magnifying glass sentenced a regiment of ants to the fires of hell. Never again. And the nuns hurrying from the church to the school, they churned up the air so that behind them it congealed in a long wave of funeral cloth. The way they threw us against the walls, those holy women, till we learned to be good. Never again. Never again Stephanie, who hit the longest ball, so quick on her feet, she beat the rest of us to teenage. Who had to get married at 15, think of it. And her father, such a good man, sweeping all night to keep the school clean of sins. No, never again. Michael, freckle-faced, smaller than me, but tougher. He knew to keep his distance when I was mad. Upon entering whose house was the lancing odor of 8 children, the week's garbage, and the parents are never home. Never again to go into battle behind him against other courtyard gangs, garbage can lids for shields, wooden arrows and swords sharpened on the mortar of our brick fortress. And Billy, first friend, who said that Robin was only sleeping and we should cover it with dirt to keep it warm. Never again, who grew up to be known throughout the projects for a bully. And Willie, his little brother, never stood forever in the doorway, not entering, not leaving, only his big belly button protruding from the house. Willie, visited by mail 8 years later and never again, his black face torn from a newspaper, breaks record in 100-yard dash. His eyes were coals singeing the paper, like the picture of a black GI killed in Vietnam or a youth found breaking and entering shot by police. Willie, never again, Willie. Sort of a childhood portrait.
Well, it's such a beautiful, breathtaking poem. And so universal and eternal. I mean, it reminds me of, Dylan Thomas is going back to his childhood and all, and not only Thomas. It brings me back to my own memories of my own childhood. I mean, which I guess is what the poem invites you to do. It go back, but then you have this line at the end about the police shooting, and of course, which brings it back very much into this moment as we think about Buffalo.
And I wrote that poem in 1974, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, things don't change.
Talent was born, and it was waiting to be discovered by Denise Levertov. When you left Buffalo and you went to Cambridge to go to MIT, and you were studying physics there, right? Mathematics and physics.
Yeah, mathematics and physics, yes.
And you were starting to write poems, but I mean, you'd written this poem, for example.
Well, this was
this is after. This came later.
This came later. Yeah, no, this after I start. I wrote, imitations of 19th century
Okay.
English romantics at the, when
Okay.
I was in her class.
Interesting.
Real juvenilia, and poems to my college girlfriend, things like that. And somehow you saw something in me to admit me into her writing.
Right. Tell us about that experience. Denis Levertov, a legendary poet, and came to America from England, and is known to, well, for many reasons, but we can talk about them. But tell us about your first meeting with Denise Levertov, how you came into her class, and how that began to change your life as a poet. Yeah.
Right. So she taught for 1 year. MIT had a provost at the time who decided that that the engineers needed to be humanized, so they created a humanities program. And since they didn't have a faculty, they sort of invited people to teach, and among them was there was Denise to teach poetry, and so a friend of mine convinced me to, as I document in the memoir. Actually, I could read a little bit of that introduction of how I got into the class. I picked her class because of my budding interest in poetry, uh, my curiosity about studying with a practicing artist. I didn't see myself as a poet then, nor did I aspire to become one. I expected to go on to graduate school, get a PhD, and pursue a career in experimental physics. I was feeling a bit anxious about encountering this exotic breed of person, the practicing poet. I'd only just learned a year or two earlier that not all poets were dead white men. Also, I had never had to pass muster to gain admission to a class, and I was without a clue as to how to conduct myself. And I announced my presence with a knock at her door for an interview. Mark Pawlak, she inquired, stressing the first syllable, speaking with a distinctly British accent. Yes. Come in, pull up a chair. And once I was seated, tell me about yourself. Ms. Levertov, call me Denise, sat behind the desk in an otherwise bare office, which she had only recently taken up occupancy. A handful of books lay on the shelf. The office was bare of pictures or decorations of any kind. She was dressed in a tight-fitting white jersey or sweater with horizontal black stripes, a dark-colored shirt, and striped stockings. Her black hair was cropped short. I noticed right off the distinctive gap in her upper front teeth, a sign of good fortune, she liked to tell people. She was surrounded by a cloud of smoke. She chain smoked, exhaling as she talked. I'll skip ahead a little bit.
Yeah. No, that very, very, very specific detail here, that on the gap tooth of Denise Levertov. You know,
So she exuded a kind of energy I'd never encountered before. And I actually had a nightmare after meeting her that day,
mm,
in which she appeared to me as the first the hookah smoking caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, and then transformed into Kali,
hmm,
the Hindu goddess, the fierce
of destruction and so on. Yeah.
destruction. Yes, and so I mean, she really made a big impression on me.
Yes. Yeah. I'm a bit too British to ask you if you also uh, fell in love with her, but I don't know. I didn't have that in my question, but one does have a relationship with one's teacher sometimes. That is,
I think I was just intrigued,
yeah,
and for a long time. I mean, really, she was came from a world I knew nothing about, and also at the time she was kind of a rising star of the American poetry avant-garde,
right, right,
and so she kind of brought that cachet too, which again was something I had never, I had no knowledge of, being kind of confined behind the gray walls of the MIT Institute, with all its laboratories and tunnels where graduate students were squirreled away.
right.
So the world of avant-garde art and culture was something entirely new as well. So it was a different, a new education for me.
Yeah, and she quickly came to really champion your poems and encourage them and speak very highly of them, and then later on invite you to give readings with her or at events at different parts of
Yeah.
town. So you became. I mean, I don't know if one can say this, a sort of a disciple, perhaps, or a follower, or at least you were
Certainly as a protege.
a protege. Yeah,
Yeah, and and our backgrounds were so different that I think I wouldn't call myself a follower, but certainly her example, in all that she taught me, were really just instrumental in my growth as a poet.
yeah. Yeah. Now the times that you were changing, right, and you were in this ferment and fervent of the Vietnam War protests, and 69, you're coming into this class, 70. Tell us about that historic sort of moment, period, and your the insight and how that contributed, shaped your writing and
Sure. Yeah. So Denise and her husband, her of a long time, although they later separated, Mitchell Goodman, were prominent, nationally renowned anti-war activists. Mitch, her husband, was actually indicted for by the federal government for conspiring with, of all people, Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, to persuade young men to resist the draft. Uh, and there was a famous trial in Boston in 1968, which was really the first Vietnam era conspiracy trial that anticipated the Chicago 7 trial. And so they were really quite well known. And then she arrived in Boston and at MIT, and MIT was kind of a hotbed of anti-war activity, in large part because students came to realize, on doing some investigation, that MIT was largely, the research being done was largely funded by the Defense Department. Some enormous figure of, like something like 75 or 80% of research at MIT was funded by the Defense Department. And so we began to raise issues, and so did many of the faculty. Was this ethical to for Institute of Higher Learning, for scientists who should be pursuing the truth of science, to be working for the government and having their research turned into weapons ultimately. And so there was a lot, it was just constant meetings and teach-ins and demonstrations and calling on the administration to reject this funding from the Defense Department. At the time, we students came to call MIT the Pentagon on the Charles.
is it still the Pentagon and the Charles today in 2022?
It is still to this day, to
It
some.
is still to this
Yeah.
day. Really interesting.
I mean, there's still a lot of of that kind of government funding. It's also, there's also been a huge explosion of biotech and bioengineering.
Right.
The back door of MIT is Kendall Square, which is probably the world hub for, Moderna is based there, and for all kinds of uh, medical and technical research. It's really that as well. But
Now, now, the time that you were living, that you write about in My Deniversity, you were engaging in debates and having conversations with fellow student poets, with Denise, with with others, Mitch Goodman, and you were participating in a sort of intellectual repartee conversation. You were learning about the tradition of poetry. Um, is there a way to compare that intellectual life that you were leading then with Denise and others to your your life today and or the lives of? I mean, are poets still engaging with each other about ideas found in books, or are they still speaking around a kind of now virtual coffee table, through the internet and so on, or are we living much more atomized lives these days, and we're missing that kind of communion that comes from close engagement with others around books and maybe my question is too abstract or too different. I'm just wanting you to think
yeah,
about your
I
times and
think I
these
hear
two
what you're
times.
saying, and I think
Yeah.
like I mean, it's just think of what our lives are like now. I get up in the morning and I have to slog through several hundred emails, most of which are worthy of the trash. But nevertheless, I'm just inundated, and they consume huge amounts of time. There's Facebook, there's all these other social media things. I mean, on the one hand, one would think, well, social media should allow us to engage people all over the world in really deep intellectual conversation. But sadly, it can happen, and it does happen, but not too often it does. It's everything but. And I think the speed uh, of transmission of ideas is such that certainly I don't write, in emails or in Facebook posts, the kind of thoughtful uh, ponderings that I did when I corresponded with Denise and other poet friends, 30 years ago, uh, by letter. There's something that's clearly been lost there. Uh, that I find all the social media pretty oppressive. I can't give it up, but I am oppressed by it, and I feel there's a loss there of I just don't have time to write the kind of uh, 3 or 4 page letters I used to write. Denise introduced me to Rilke, and into Rilke's correspondence in his letters, which go on. They're like little novellas. They're just amazing. Just covering a broad range of topics, and deep, his deep learning coming forward. Uh, it's just something that's lost. I think.
Yeah, I wonder if it's lost, then have we somehow failed our teachers, or have we failed the traditions into which we were born, and you know, I'm or if I tend to be called an inveterate optimist, so then if it's lost, then how can we be regained? And let's go about regaining it, finding new ways to engage, revive the flame that's. But let's talk about for a little bit about your goals then, perhaps as a poet, when you were starting out, and did you have particular goals? And if so, have you achieved those goals? And perhaps you can read a couple of more poems too to give while you
I,
think about the answer. Yeah.
yeah, I think I did not have any specific goals. Poetry and poets and the tradition intrigued me. I wanted, I felt I had a lot of, having grown up as a science geek, I had a lot of catching up to do in terms of reading.
Mm.
And so I just, immersed myself in reading. And I was lucky to have someone like Levertov to offer me guidance. I mean, I had free access to her library. I could go visit her house anytime I wanted, and and pick a book off the shelf and borrow it, or sit in her dining room and read it. And then she would engage me in conversation when she wasn't busy, and that was kind of a rare thing. And that's kind of where the title of the memoir comes from, My Deniversity. It kind of plays on uh, you know Ezra Pound's when in the 1930s he was living in Italy, and poets made pilgrimages to kind of to sit at his knees, uh, and he would invite them to just kind of visit him in his house, have lunch with him, take strolls with him, and they would talk poetry the whole time. And that was kind of what Denise offered to me, and he used to call it his Esuversity.
Right, right.
And so I borrowed that idea that my engagement with her was my Deniversity. uh, and that was very special. And so goals, I just wanted to write better poems, uh, and for a long time, I think I just wanted to write poems that would please her. You know, that
Mm-mm.
I had, you know, if she said, "Yeah, that's good," that was all I needed. You know, later, I think later, I my goals were to kind of, I mean, as I read, you know, I started out reading, you know, the Romantics because that was kind of the tradition that she came out of. And then, you know, the new American poets, Williams and Pound, and then her generation, uh, you know, the Beats, San Francisco Renaissance, the Black Mountain poets. Uh, and then I kind of expanded, you know, and again, to some degree, she was influential here too, because having grown up in England and having kind of a cosmopolitan family background, her father had grown up as a Russian rabbinical tradition and converted to the Anglican Church. Uh, she, you know, she was surrounded by books and by European literature as well, and so she introduced me to those traditions. So, you know, I became immersed in the Russian poets, Pasternak and Akhmatova, and then the early Soviets, Mayakovsky, and then Latin American poets, Neruda and Vallejo, uh, and Mr. Cardinal, Bertolt Brecht back in Germany. You know, so a wide reading to supplement kind of the American poetry that I was also deeply immersed in.
I must say you're one of the most well-read poets that I know. Perhaps I'm just impressed by the range, and the commitment you have to reading, which of course Borges had, and great poets read and then they produce and then they write. I think the two go together. But you have had this commitment for many decades, and then I think of you as a teacher. So someone somewhere is writing his or her version of the University of Mark, or the Pavlakian principles. I mean, it's natural. It's we leave our traces in others with whom we walk along the path. But as you're walking along this path and aware of the calamities of today and also all the noise of the internet and everything else, but yet there are, of course, inevitably many more poets today than there were 30 years ago. There's just many more people on the planet, and so the statistics would suggest that we have a lot more poets to contend with. But you have
We also have the MFA programs, which have proliferated, and
That's right. That's right.
factors producing poets.
But you have a particular story. Everyone has their unique set of lines on their hands and their unique way of writing, their signature. But in your case, that signature is also connected to roots, working class roots of a certain kind, which tell us about that, how that growing up in a quote-unquote working class family, how that has influenced your poetics or your political choices, or is it just where you came from and so you write about it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, so that first book, the Buffalo Sequence, in a certain way was my, you know, if you think of, you know, me as, you know, someone who, you know, as I said, I was a science, you know, science geek. I grew up in
Right.
I was part of the Sputnik generation, which is how I got to MIT on a scholarship. Uh, and you know, and so we a lot of my, you know, ethnic working class Polish background kind of was suppressed because to sort of be successful in that kind of academic world, achieving world. And so when I began to write poems, I realized that there was a great loss there, that I, you know, that I had kind of forgotten a lot of those stories from my childhood and the things that
Mhm.
I cared about. And that was how I started writing the Buffalo Sequence, was an attempt to kind of recapture, those memories and to uh, articulate the value of those experiences. So there was certainly that, and then I taught in a alternative high school here in Cambridge that I helped start, where my students were high school dropouts who were kids from poor and working class families, and I got to be very close with many of them. And again, they kind of seeing their lives brought back memories from my childhood, and those things entered into the Buffalo sequence as well. But then later on, as I became in later books, uh, I started having arguments with my parents and with uh, my my roots in a sense, because there was a lot of you know racism and xenophobia and all these things embedded in the working class, and I thought they were really duped by politicians like Ronald Reagan, who my parents voted for, and who basically uh, sold out the working class. And so I started, influenced by Bertolt Brecht to a degree. I started writing, poems trying to address political themes or the language that politicians use to obfuscate the truth.
Right, to fool you.
Yeah, and I was, and the audience I had in mind was really my parents or my, my peers growing up in Buffalo who didn't go on to college, and who were uh, duped, as I felt. And so that became kind of a topic of poems for a while. A series of, I wrote a whole collection of what I called newspaper poems, in which I kind of
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
took apart the news and you know tried to show what was really going on, as it were.
It was around that time that we met for the first time.
I think so. Yes. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and a couple of thoughts. Richard Rodriguez wrote a book called Days of Obligation, an argument with my Mexican father. I was listening to you
Okay.
talk
Yeah.
about your arguments with your roots.
Yeah.
I thought of that title anyway. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
different tradition,
No,
but
it's a terrific book, and I
yeah. And and then I can't help but ask a question about Hanging Loose because, of course, that's a whole side of you, which is the editor and the publisher and the champion of poets, and you know, I mean, you give them a home, you give them a way in the world, um, and so they become part of your list, and and so tell us
well, they
about
also
that
yeah,
aspect of your.
yeah. So yeah, so as Hanging Loose. So ironically, Hanging Loose started in 1966. Uh, my first poems were published in Hanging Loose because Levertov, who was a contributing editor to the magazine,
Yeah,
was offered, a select to select a group of poems to publish in the magazine that she curated. And so she selected one of my, she basically picked poems from our MIT poetry class and published them in Hanging Loose. So that was my introduction to Hanging Loose. And then it was another decade later that I got to meet some of the editors and was invited to join the editorial board. But I think in addition to serving poets by publishing them and helping in editing their work and helping them uh, put forward their work in the best light. Uh, it's also a community of friends. I mean, and colleagues that I've acquired by being an editor of Hanging Loose. I think of we recently just had a big memorial service for one of our founding editors, Robert Hirschon, in Brooklyn. 150 poets showed up for this event, and I knew most of them. Many of them I had published individual poems. Many of them I'd helped publish books by, and they're my community, as are you. You're part of that community. that's one of the things I gained from it's hard work, and there's we don't we don't get paid for it, but we do it out of love for poetry and love for the importance of keeping voices that we care about available for younger readers.
Yeah, you keep books in print, which is an amazing commitment, right?
And and we also discover, your first book was published by Hanging Loose,
Right.
and one of the things
And
we're proudest of is that we've discovered, discovered. I mean, it's a funny word in the sense that who discovers whom? If you send work to to the magazine and we like it, did we discover you, or did you discover us? But a great number of poets who've gone on to great acclaim have started their first work was published in Hanging Loose. Herman Alexie, Kimiko Han, Kathy Park Hong, Maggie Nelson. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And that's something we're really proud of.
yeah, I mean, it's not only a list; it's also a part of American literature. It's a part of political space and historical space and time. Who are the poets of this time? And then one can go to the list of Hanging Loose and get a picture of what people are thinking about and writing about, feeling, and so it's very important work. It's done for love, and we're grateful, and readers are grateful. And tell me how the editor then becomes the poet, or are they two very separate things, or are they one part and parcel of the same creative thrust?
Yeah, I think they're, this will date us both, but probably remember the wiggle cards. The little cards where there would be two different images, and
Oh yes,
a
yes, right.
plastic card, and you would see Superman.
That's right. That's right.
And you would wiggle it from another direction, and
Yeah.
into Clark Kent, or something like that. Uh, and I think of the poet editor as kind of living simultaneously those two roles and wiggling back and forth between them, and they're indistinguishable. And many times I'm inspired by poets, poems submitted to the magazine, to write new poems myself. It's not just a one-way street.
No, no. Let's hear a few more poems, shall we, before we...
Let's do that. Yeah. I
yeah.
thought. Go. What did you want to say? Go ahead.
No, no, I was just saying, and while you're thinking of which ones, I'll just remind readers and listeners, My Deniversity, published by MadHat Press, which is based in Cheshire, Massachusetts. And the book is available on Amazon and you can order it from your local bookstore. It's a rare book, or perhaps even a unique book, because it tells a particular story about a poet and his teacher, and a particular time in American and world history that where we can all sort of understand our own dilemmas as we live now through times of war and uncertainty, and how this poet and his teacher managed those times. And so, yeah, I think it's a useful guidebook as well to living, as well as a great read. So I invite you to look for it, My Deniversity. And now, Mark, perhaps...
So I'll read a couple of poems. Roy. Maybe I'll start with a poem that this is from a book I published maybe a decade ago called Official Versions.
Okay. Ominous title, Official Versions.
Yeah. So, and again, there's a lot of is written during the Bush Gulf War and
Mm.
11, etc.
Oh, for nostalgia, for simpler. I mean, when you compare it to the Trump period we just lived through.
Right,
Anyway,
exactly.
yeah. But go ahead.
So here's a poem that kind of written shortly after 9/11. That and this is something I've written some essays about. That political poetry is kind of often attacked as being kind of of the moment, and then it's forgotten because the moment has passed.
Mm.
But sadly, in our lives, we see those moments. History repeats. History rhymes, I guess, is the way to say it.
Right.
And so sadly, poems written 20 years ago become relevant again. So I'm thinking of Afghanistan. So this was called All the News, September 23rd, 2001. And it begins with an epigraph that was a popular American joke on late night TV in 2001. Question: why aren't there any Walmarts in Afghanistan? Answer: because they're all targets. This is a found poem from the Times. According to the Times, quote, Air Force bombers are heading toward distant airfields to fight a shadowy foe flitting through the mountains in a deeply hostile land, already so poor and so ruined by 2 decades of war that it is virtually bereft of targets. Forget the past, the headline instructs. It's a war unlike any other. And that was a found poem from that era.
Mm.
Yeah, really.
I mean, unsettling, these found poems because I mean, you cannot deny them. But yet, it's as if they're just they're waiting to be discovered, and they're like live ammunition, live grenades or something in your hand once you find them.
Well, as with found art in general, it's the framing that makes
Right, right.
the poem. I'm going to read another one because I guess Afghanistan was recently on my mind, and in our tragic history there. This is called a capsule history of Herat, Afghanistan. After the Mujahideen had defeated their communist overlords, the men of Herat took to the streets behind their leader Ismail Khan, chanting slogans and firing rifles into the air. The women of Herat, covered head to toe in burqas, stood in doorways watching the celebration through narrow eye slits. Then the holy warriors of Herat allied with the Taliban to install Islamic rule over the country. For 2 years, they laid siege to the capital, Kabul. After the last holdouts surrendered, the fighting men returned home. They ran through the street of Herat, shouting in celebration and firing their rifles into the air. Covered head to toe in burqas, the women of Herat stood in doorways watching through narrow eye slits. Finally, the Americans came. Their troops chased the Taliban fighters back into the mountains and established democratic rule throughout Afghanistan. Now allied with the victors, the holy warriors of Herat once again took to the streets, chanting slogans and firing their rifles into the air. Standing in doorways covered head to toe in burqas, the women of Herat looked on through narrow eye slits.
Mm.
Those are all images that I
Right.
took out of the news, really. Tried to put some meaning to them. Let me read a couple. So I don't only write political poetry.
Right. No, no, and that first the pieces from the poems from the Buffalo Sequence, evidence of that. Yeah. But read. I mean, let's just as we're thinking of coming up on the hour and this an hour with this book and What? Just one last question. Always the question that Rilke wrote about, and others have written about. Letters to a young poet, letters to a young writer. I mean, Rilke's model has been used by other writers, like Vargas Llosa, for example, as letters to a young novelist. And so, what is your letters? What will it say, or what is it? What have you said already?
I think and Ilka figured deeply into this. That I think that one has to, look, look to literature that one cares about, find models, seek mentors where possible, uh, find colleagues, because it's difficult to to stay with writing. The rewards in a society that cares so much about money and prestige, etc., uh, in positions are rarely there for poets. So it's a hard road to follow, and so having colleagues who you share your work with and who support you uh, and can be critical in friendly ways are really important, and and make space in your life to maintain dialogue with your inner self, which is again increasingly difficult to do in our media saturated world, because that's where the poems come from. And that's a it's a prescription that one has to find their own solution to. I suppose.
Yeah, but it's beautifully stated. Keep that space, make that space open for that dialogue with your interior self. Yes.
Can I read one last poem?
Yes, yes. We should always finish with a poem. It's almost like in the mass of poetry. We have to finish with
Excellent.
the
Okay.
word. Yeah. And
And
thank you, Mark, for this time.
thank you
And yeah,
for your
well,
for the opportunity and for your questions. Uh, so this is a poem from my latest poetry collection called Reconnaissance, uh, and I live in Boston. I travel by public transportation, bus and subways, and so I also write a lot of kind of flaneur poems, observing observing people in the city, on the bus, on the train, etc. So this poem is called "With Apologies to Rilke," and the epigraph uh, is from his famous poem "The Archaic Torso of Apollo." I'll read it in German. "Du musst dein Leben ändern." So in German, that's the final line of the poem says, "You must change your life." Play with that phrase in German. So it's a poem in three parts. One, 5 a.m. dark, ruckus of house sparrows nesting in bedroom air conditioner, tinkle of porch wind chimes, kitchen fridge hum, toilet flush, water coursing through pipes, gurgle and burp of coffee maker, heels clicking against hardwood floors downstairs, distant church bells gong, all distract, but only momentarily, from the mice gnawing in my mind's attic. Ich muss mein Leben ändern. Station. Boss, one Metro hawker is saying to another as I hurry past to catch my train. Boss, I ain't got no boss. I got supervisors. I ain't got no boss. 3. Red line inbound. Eyes wander to banner ads pasted above windows across aisle. One in bold lettering inquires, "You worry a lot?" Yes, I admit, I do. Feel nervous most of the time? Uh-huh. Feel anxious in social or performance situations? That's me. Have distress, flashbacks, or nightmares from trauma? Not from trauma. Are you anxious? Bingo. Call 866-44-WORRY. Ich muss mein Leben ändern.
Oh,
Little
wonderful.
community humor there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We need that, and I think that's a beautiful way to close for the moment, because I hope we can find more time on another occasion to talk about poems and books and life, and I hope you'll come and read from your work in Washington
I
someday.
definitely, I'm definitely feeling that it's time to travel, and every time I think about traveling to do readings in distant cities, some new variation of Omicron strikes,
Right, right,
COVID
right.
strikes, and scuttles those plans. But I'm certainly hopeful that something I can do in the near future. I'd really like to do that very much.
Good. We'll be waiting for you here. All the best. I'm talking from Rockville, Maryland, but of course this program will be heard anywhere you have the internet. Thank you so much, Mark, and once
Indran.
again, My Deniversity, and Mark Pawlak, poet, editor, friend. Thank you. Thank you.